Imagine being handed to you a master list of every questionable thing that you've ever done in your entire life. Hi, I'm Gianni Canyanis, and this is What Would You Do? To quote a philosopher, everything is romantic. What if everything is problematic? Should we talk about how an unsuspecting Tumblr blog from the early 2010s catalyzed a massive digital cultural shift that affects to this day how we view celebrities, accountability, and call-out culture? This is the legacy of Your Fave is Problematic. If you remember this blog, firstly, hi, nearly 30-year-old. A little bit is about Tumblr. In its heyday, it was the social media website for anyone who is under 25 that fostered a messy terrain of interactions and a whole host of different social groups, all organized and fostered loosely around different communities, for example, fandoms. We had Super Wholock, which is a big one. That's Sherlock, Doctor Who, and Supernatural. You joined this group if you were a nerdy 13-year-old with no friends named Divya. Tributes, I made these specifically for Tumblr. I had one passion, and that was graphic design. And literally everything else, like directioners of Mice and Men. I'm being so serious. But more than just a place for fandom and telling your crush that you like them through indirect posts, pretty pictures, and aesthetics. It was really a place for marginalized communities to come together and also for social justice. Unlike Facebook, which required your real names, here you could just be represented by whatever fixation you were into at the time. Tumblr let you be anonymous and yet reveal very hyper-specific details about yourself. Really, you could talk and learn about politics through pop culture. I'm being serious. You would have these intersectional, feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist readings paired with like a gift set of a show. Or you'd have a seemingly innocuous post saying something like, "Why are 15-year-olds so angry? Because F you." And then it just ends with healthcare. Me being 14 years old, living in England with the NHS, I was like, actually, yeah, you know what? You are so right. Reblog. And for young people, it was a site that allowed them access to a form of political agency. So much so that there was even a phrase and they called it, Tumblr activism, or for the more severe version, getting radicalized by Tumblr. I remember learning what the word microaggression was, and I was like, is that the word for when my biology teacher doesn't call me by my correct name for 4 years? Or is that the word for the time where I had just met this dude and we were talking about, what are your favorite songs or music you'd like to listen to? And he was like, I bet your favorite one is Yellow by Coldplay. Because, I'm Asian. Is that just racism? I digress, but the point being, these different pockets of communities were very influential, an important factor to consider for what comes next. Because in the summer of 2013, when the world was eating horse meatballs and playing Flappy Birds, already seasoned Tumblr users Lila and 17-year-old Rai decided to create the blog Your Fave is Problematic. Okay, here's how this blog is going to work. Instead of being a collection of individual incidents, it's going to be constantly updated master posts for each poster. It is a blog solely focused on celebrities and documenting all of their transgressions, aka being problematic. And to be fair to them, this was the year that Blurred Lines was topping the charts. Firstly, if you don't know the song Blurred Lines, I envy you, because this was a song that put the con in consent, meaning that there was none. And bam! The first post, Louis C.K. Louis C.K. is this comedian guy. The first post contained a lot of his kind of poor taste jokes. Since that blog post, which was in 2013, in 2017, it's actually come out that he has a slew of sexual misconduct allegations, which I'm like, that being their first post was kind of crazy. Did they know something? The next post was about Vanessa Hudgens, mostly just a bunch of weird comments and a lot of appropriation of the bindi, causing me to Google stuff like, is Vanessa Hudgens Hindu? So really, you know what, this blog is educational, right? In the blog's frequently asked questions, they state clearly that its aims are to document, we are record keepers and nothing more. If your fave is on the list, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad people, nor does it mean that you can't like them. All it means is that you should acknowledge their flaws and that they should be held accountable for them. Did somebody say receipts? I think as an idea, a collated easy access style list of stuff that's already been public and documented seems like, okay, we're making something accessible and easy to find. If you want to shift culture for a more equitable society, accountability is an important factor of it. From very passive celebrity idolization and worship to being more active and critical consumers of these public figures, right? These people who are at the top of the chain with all these masses of wealth and influence. Who do we actually want to actively support? Instead of just like waiting for gossip magazines or like reporters, digital spaces are allowed for anyone, and including marginalized communities, to really have an active say and a voice in saying, hey, that's kind of not great what you're doing. You get to be the judge in the digital court of social justice and morality. But you'll find the statement of them being record keepers and nothing more not entirely true, which will become very evident to you as you continue to watch and as I continue to explain and reveal what happened next. The intent didn't quite match the impact, and as the blog states, intent doesn't matter. I went through all 40-something pages of this, and you'll find that in a lot of posts, a lot of it contained quotes that celebrities had said. To be fair, the vast majority of it was valid. And you would have hyperlinks to things. I think a lot of the links now are defunct, but we can just owe that to the blog being kind of old. Sometimes you had no quotes at all. For Justin Bieber, it said that he appropriates AAV a lot, which, yeah, that's true. But record keeping, you're gonna have to find that yourself. And as we all know, especially on the internet, people tend to be very lazy. And this idea will play a very, 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 very key role in how we navigate digital activism today, which I'll explain later on. All the while, their askbox was filled to the brim with people asking for explanation, clarification, and rectification. And a lot of times they would get hit back with reiteration that this is about keeping a record and it's not about education. The famous phrase, it's not my role to educate you. A form of digital activism that tended to meet education more often than not, I feel like, were Instagram posts. And like Tumblr, social media became a platform not only for people to engage in activism online, but also as a way to curate identity. And sometimes not in the best way. Hence giving birth to Instagram activism. And to really illustrate an example of what I mean, here's one that I made using Kiddle, which I love to use for all of the graphics in this video. So we had aesthetic activism. Some posts were bold, eye-catching infographics that also helped mobilize, but maybe they lost a bit of context and a bit of nuance. Other posts had the opposite problem, overwhelmed with information for an audience that swipes past faster than a billboard on a highway. But with Kiddle, we don't have that problem anymore. Anyone can create really visually compelling and impactful posts that can help convey your message a little bit more effectively. I love using Kiddle because it's intuitive and user-friendly, and massive library of professional templates make it so much easier to make content that stands out for whatever your needs, whether that is social media activism, maybe it's posters, merch, books, blogs. But just like the blog, Instagram activism also fell into very similar traps of criticism. In its early days, at least, for being too shallow, performative, and self-serving. Even if it was well-intentioned, we had this weird tone disconnect between using, sparkly, bubbly, rounded fonts to convey a very serious message. Using Kiddle's extensive font library, you can literally search via Vibes over 1,000 fonts. Kiddle lets you choose the font and edit them to actually match the tone of the message that you're trying to say. At least Tumblr would let you post these massive, lengthy blogs. But with Instagram, at least a couple of years ago, to become repostable, everything had to be aesthetic. Sometimes aestheticism overshadowed the message. And Kiddle helps me maintain aesthetics here with their inbuilt library of textures, photos, and also really easy editing tools like background removal to focus your attention where it actually matters. What do you think? Would this do well to spread awareness? But on a real note, I hope that Kiddle removes barriers and really empowers you to create things that matter to you. Like a Pinterest board that you can actually edit. You can try Kiddle for free using my link in the description. And thank you, let's all give a round of applause and thank you to Kiddle for sponsoring my As much as Instagram shouldn't be your only place of education and performative posts aside, on the whole, it felt like a really net positive platform. You had the ability to engage people in your real life, personal, direct social circles, because Tumblr, Twitter, you don't really want IRLs being your moods, right? On Instagram, depending on what type of account you were, more likely than not, you had a few people that you actually knew in your circles. And so you had a greater scope of impact. How great that we used and utilized a site that was just meant for sharing memories, sharing aesthetic pics, and actually using it to mobilize. To be fair to the blog and to its credit, they did also have, supporting evidences in the case of photos and videos. I went through all of them, and a lot of them were basically just white celebrities doing cultural colonialism. A lot of them are so obsessed with the bindi. Is this Nepali queen? Is this Selena Gomez? This video isn't a debate on the ethics of cultural appropriation, but I do think it's important to understand the context in which actions take place. Because not all instances labeled as cultural appropriation in this case were of equal harm. For example, is it fair to really put a case of cultural appropriation when the celebrity or public figure is just wearing the clothes because they're visiting the country? Compare that to them being like, oh, it's Halloween, you know what's so scary? Ethnic minorities. Let's dress up as them. And another point on the inconsistencies in the record keeping, they would include stuff that wasn't pertaining to the actions of the individual itself, but how society is. I'll explain. For example, Jennifer Lawrence, who has done, her own fair share of just weird stuff. There was one point that said, this isn't strictly her fault, but remember when she gave the photographer a finger at the Oscars? And the author notes how it was perceived as a funny, quirky moment, but when MIA did a similar thing, people viewed it as obscene. Actually, yes, valid. Let's talk about that. Double standards and racism. But in a blog titled, Your Fave is Problematic, is it a fair criticism to conflate societal biases to individual responsibility? And B, if so, are we saying that both instances of giving the middle finger is the problematic thing? I feel ironically, this comment was kind of one of the more illuminating parts of this blog, because it asks us to consider not just individual responsibility, but what are the broader social structures allow something like this to happen, right? So it was a point of education. Some people were boss level problematic, and then other people were one-hit wonders. And what does accountability mean? And as it went on, it devolved from legitimate criticism, legitimate instances of celebrities being a bit whack, and into something a bit more, I don't know the right word, but unserious. Some posts include things that celebrities did as children. We also had not just the big stars, but also internet celebrities. For example, Tyler Oakley, he was included for a whole bunch of reasons, some of them being the fact that he was hypocritical. What was the offense, you ask? Shopping at Urban Outfitters. Also, Tyler at one point said, hating someone really means that you hate yourself. But then they found an instance where he was hating on somebody else. And the source was a Tumblr hate blog dedicated to hating Tyler Oakley. Is this normal behavior? And it just feels like such a moot point to include something like this, oh, you're being slightly hypocritical, which is who isn't? Some of the offenses were repeatedly playing manic pixie dream girls, of which I feel could be an interesting conversation in the wider dynamics of the film industry. But the problem is, in these lists, when you insert your own opinions, your own sense of morality, and the examples that we've shown before, I think it blurs the line between, is this actually objective documentation? Or are we going into the territory of subjective criticism? I just want to say, this is not a defense against celeb bootlicking video, or I hope it doesn't come out that way. It's more about the question of impact. What's the impact of digital spaces and how we go about social justice? Is it effective? As the blog got bigger, it also gained a sense of authority. And with great authority comes great responsibility. Without context, the criticisms feel arbitrary. Placed next to more serious issues, we lack proportionality. And when we arrive at a conclusion without explanation, we cease to function as an effective form of activism, and it turns into the few surveilling the few. We started to lose sight of the bigger picture, which was, stuff like education, addressing inequality, allyship, and yes, even accountability, and ultimately change. We risk becoming the digital morality police, and you know how we feel about those. But back to the case of Tumblr and Your Fave is Problematic, it begs the question, are people born problematic? Do they achieve problematism? Or do they have problematic thrust upon them? One author even submitted himself to the blog, and a very notable point of contention in the history of Your Fave is Problematic is the case of John Green. John Green's the type of guy to have like 1,000 credentials in his like Twitter bio. Well-renowned author, famous. He was entrepreneur of like a lot. Founded VidCon, created Crash Course, founded a charity. He had a really popular blog with his brother Hank called Vlog Brothers. Garnered a very significant community, and they called themselves Nerd Fighters. And the main aim was to help fight against world suck. And some would argue to his downfall, he was also very active with his community on Tumblr. The Tumblr John Green thing could be a whole video in itself, but essentially he was such a force in that little sphere of Tumblr that there was even a game, Is That a John Green, where people would post something sort of John Green related. It became a game to see how long would it take for John Green to respond to this thing. Apart from some discourse about like, oh, he uses manic pixie dream girls in his novels and like the teenagers are pretentious sounding, all in all, it was a pretty positive vibe. Until the post. Your Favorite Problematic's post about John Green contained criticism both relating to his characters and also things that he himself said, and many of which he actually ended up addressing and became noted on the blog. And some of these pertain to things that his characters said. The context of the book is about the flaws of viewing women as manic pixie dream girl, point of view of a teenage boy, and then as the book he basically learns to grow up. Like writing about misogyny is fine, especially in that context. It will be a bit different if the text itself was misogynistic, which I feel like is a very important distinction to make. If the writing wasn't strong enough to make that point across, then okay, fair, but I feel like most people kind of got the gist of his work. This isn't specifically about John Green or whatever. I think the broader point is mischaracterized, out of context quotes amongst, legitimate criticism. Not only are you spreading false narratives, but I feel like it also devalues what the blog could have been, and it just turns into a death note. So there was one comment where John was replying to it, and he said something along the lines of like, attributing a quote by Shakespeare to me is not fair. And I, for the life of me, could not find what point he was referring to, because I feel like they've edited it, and if they did that, that's kind of hilarious. I'm not gonna lie. Your one friend that's too woke. But you'll find that this pattern of behavior is very, very pertinent on Twitter, with some things that you wouldn't even believe, but just wait for that. You'll need to buckle up. That wasn't even the most controversial part of this whole event. Because one bullet point in the original post pertained that John was problematic because of a very damning statement that he may have essayed a fan. Now, I can't find the screenshot of when they included this, but the people who ran the blog have addressed it, and so has John, so it did happen. The source in question was a singular anonymous ask, which was a form of one-to-one communication between the asker and the person who ran the blog, but it also acted like a sort of pseudo-broadcast channel. The post stated that John Green is also really creepy towards his fans. There was one instance where a girl met him and said his books helped her cope with SA, and then he started stroking her. That and his books being drenched in manic pixie dream girl tropes made me feel like he's a predator, which is enough for me to have his name Tumblr savior. The author then responded this a few times, stating that is a very serious accusation and it is completely unambiguously untrue. In another instance, he said, in addition to never having essayed a fan, I have never, at least that I can recall, stroked a fan. I don't really know what stroking is in this context. I don't really touch strangers, to be honest, because of my anxiety disorder. That line was then removed from the post. And on the accusation of being problematic for being creepy, a couple years later, not related to Your Fave is Problematic, but on a separate note, another user created a statement about, John Green, and it ended up garnering 40,000 notes. And the post said, I bet John Green thinks people don't like him because he's a dork or a nerd or whatever, when in reality it's because he's a creep who panders to teenage girls so that he can amass some weird cult-like following. And it's always girls who feel misunderstood, and he goes out of his way to make them feel important and desirable. Also, he has a social media presence that is equivalent to that dad of a kid in your friend group who always volunteers to supervise the pool parties and scoots his lawn chair close to all the girls. John responded to this saying throwing that kind of accusation around is sick and libelous, and most importantly damages this discourse around the actual essay of children. I'm tired of seeing the language of social justice, important language doing important work, misused as a way to dehumanize others and treat them hatefully. As studies have shown, the complicated dopamine rush that comes with right indignation is very powerful. And I'm indulging it simply by responding to the outrageous accusation that my work is somehow evidence of SA. And while there are wonderful examples of outrage fueling long-term productive responses to injustice, too often the internet moves from jolt to jolt, from hatred to hatred, ever more convinced of our own righteousness and the world's evil. And getting caught up in that is very painful. But this stops being a productive place for me to be in conversations if I'm not allowed to be wrong, if my apologies are not acknowledged alongside my misdeeds, and if I'm not treated like a person. At this point, it's impossible to continue to use Tumblr in the way that I've used it since 2011. Also, I'm not angry or anything like that, I just need distance for my well-being. And so a whole wave of authors then came to his defense to say, hey, we have an example of this white, successful, privileged male author who has a lot more power than an anonymous person who is most probably a teenager or at least a young adult, and most probably a girl, woman, saying they feel uncomfortable. And you also have 40,000 other odd people agreeing to it, or maybe not that many agree to it, but at least a good substantial number, right? By liking or reblogging. And to ignore that is to perpetuate the marginalization of voices. And what is his defense? Voiceover, because I forgot some parts. I don't know what specific part of the original post uses words of social justice. I wonder if he's responding to the overall compounding of accusations and whatever. At the same time as I think young people are allowed to feel creeped out by someone, you're also allowed to defend yourself against the idea that writing YA novels as a man and using social media means you are creepy pedo vibes, especially when people are just egging you on to respond to it. Should he have responded to it? I don't really know. It's a little bit complicated because there is this power dynamic, and all of his other friends also compounded, replied to it, and eventually the person deactivated. Maybe there are specific instances unsaid in that original post that contributed to the creepy vibes that weren't explained. Maybe there isn't. This is what we have to go off with. I also feel like at the same time there is this presumably young person who's finding their footing publicly on the internet. As a human, people will respond to these accusations. As a public figure, there's a whole other layer added. Beyond the idea of is it creepy or not, is John Green a creep or not, is not the point. It's more about how do we navigate space on the internet and how do we navigate the use of language and how we communicate with each other. The use of very definitive language really came to shape the culture beyond Tumblr, for better or worse. Long before that awful Imagine COVID video, the disillusionment of celebrities was already on its way, right? The domino effect, its impact was very astounding. We moved past just Hollywood elites and we started incorporating influencers. The boom of Instagram, the boom of YouTube was also really popping. Gave birth to a rise of its own cultural phenomenon, which was the YouTuber apology video. No edits, no makeup, a little bit of a tear, and no production, which then caused its own culture of reacting to said apology video. If you want to be a more conscious reader, we also had Your Favorite Author is Problematic. Now, they had its own dedicated Tumblr blog, but we also saw this instance on Twitter, which was even worse than Your Favorite is Problematic, because at least Your Favorite is Problematic included quotes. This one was just like, number one, you're racist. There was no distinction between are they referring to like a fictional event in the novel or are they referring to something that the author said did. My favorite part is when they included Shakespeare, who, you know, died in the 1600s and is a product of his time, for being not woke enough because he was racist and sexist. And then above you just have Colleen Hoover. No notes, nothing, but I just want to let you know she's problematic enough to have made it on this list. You know what? Actually, very interesting discussion. Birth to tweets like a list of problematic authors: Kafka, overly sentimental; Plath, depressed; Camus, French. But don't worry, because authors strike back with your reader is problematic. I wish I was you. There was a document of readers who were deemed problematic, and their offense was pirating a book. We see the influence in language over time. Stuff like problematic, that was a read, dragged, or your problematic fave. Hashtag insert person here is over party. Digital activism gained a lot of critics. You social justice warrior. And it's like, hey, if you wanted to really like be insulting. You couldn't have thought of like a less cool name? Like, are you for real? Woke? Thank you. Speaking of language, you see, definitive, assertive ways. It's stark, it's unequivocal, it's very binary, black and white thinking. Twitter has more of a problem with this. Tumblr and Twitter both benefit from this mask of anonymity. And I also feel like it influenced how we act even in the public space. If you're in a bit of a tiff with somebody, you whip your phone out and you start to record. Firstly, because it's an act of self-preservation for you. And secondly, some people just want to post it and get, they say, Twitter, do your thing, find this other person. But when we find out that like a regular person has done something wrong or you want to stand someone, you go on their social media accounts, you start searching for what have they said, what have they not said. Normal behavior. Bad stuff aside, we also had some really great organic movements that came from call-out culture. Particularly in situations where there's these really large power imbalances and where having, people say, why don't you just have a private conversation? Well, sometimes if you have a private conversation with some of these people, you will get a lot of behind-the-scenes backlash, behind-the-scenes sabotage, and sometimes it can just be unsafe. A really notable example was Me Too. We're using a hashtag to create this online movement where call-out became a trend and a really important one to actively change material conditions or create an ongoing change. Whether that be legislation, high-profile men getting what they deserve, and trying to, as a collective, hold businesses also accountable, which can be hard for just like a singular person to do. Black Twitter are also really powerful in self-organizing and mobilizing movements. We had Oscar So White highlighting inequalities and hypocrisies in media, but we also had stuff that pertained to more everyday people like police brutality. When talking about well-known call-outs of like toxic workplace cultures, Ellen DeGeneres really comes to mind. I remember she also crossed the picket line for like the writer's strike. Anyway, she's like fled over here now. On other platforms, Reddit also actively behaves like your fave a lot of times. On TikTok, you might have actual faces and people analyzing things, but they also benefit because you can have slideshows and text posts. Jared Leto, harasser, pedo. Kristen Stewart, cheater, bad actor, gets rolled. But I think Twitter is the biggest spiritual successor to the essence of Your Fave is Problematic, and I argue worse. You've probably seen tweets in the rough form of something along the lines of, why celebrity is a horrible person and you should not support them, thread, which I don't think is inherently like a bad thing in itself. I think the problem is when this really gets weaponized, most of the time against women. And instead of helping people be like critical consumers of media, sometimes it's just like popular accounts are actively participating in smear campaigns against celebrities that they just don't like, spreading literal misinformation, or there's cases where they theorize about like a celebrity's sexuality and they theorize, oh, they must be queer baiting. Couple that with an algorithm that just shows you what you engage with and the social proof of like, hey, loads of people are liking and reblogging this thing, you come to think of something as true. I'd have seen interactions where someone's like, oh my god, I can't stand person, and then someone else writes, hey, why, what did they do? Genuine. And then the person's like, she's racist. Media literacy is down, guys, and when you solely rely on somebody else's analysis that has no supporting context, no supporting evidence, it's like, yeah, sure, you could do your exam based on a SparkNotes analysis, but when your activism starts and ends with reading a Twitter thread, when your language doesn't allow for any form of ambiguity when the situation so calls for it, and when you don't try and understand why something is problematic, we do nothing to shift discourse, to shift the structures that are upholding this, and then we have a group of people who are just unable to think for themselves, really, I think is the point I'm trying to get. Ironically, it's like that Tumblr post that's like, people are saying things so definitively. Over a decade has passed since that blog's inception. And one of the creators of the blog actually wrote a blog about it, My Year of Grief and Cancellation. They called the blog a vengeful public shaming masquerading as social criticism. You should read the post for yourself in its entirety because it's too long for me to like read it out loud to you. I think it's really interesting to hear the author's own motivations, especially when a decade has passed. their prefrontal cortex is, fully formed. And like, what was their intent? Because you really come to feel a sense of empathy and understanding as to how this blog was like a source of catharsis for them. Some notable quotes: she said, "I was thinking I was making a difference when engaging in a bit of schadenfreude. I was interested in knocking people off their pedestals. I also enjoyed being popular, controversial, discuss. I was cataloging it to make a case against the rich and famous, and I was angered by hypocrisy and cruelty." And what I found interesting was that during the blog, a reaction that the author got was they started to receive threats, right? Someone sent me a screenshot of a house from Google Maps claiming to have found my IP address. And although we've already mentioned how like not all of the blog was like entirely responsible, this reaction by the public also reveals the dangers of like what happens to women when they speak up. Ironically, it's an example of why celebrity worship does need to be dismantled. So do you think the impact of Your Fave is Problematic was like a net positive or a net negative? It sparked really necessary conversations, and it democratized a form of digital protest, if you want to call it that. But in its dark side, without responsible calling out and created by bad faith actors, it veered into moral puritanism, and I'd call it performative. Because what was about accountability, amplifying marginalized voices, driving social change, nitpicking and focusing really overshadowed meaningful dialogue. That's what I have to say. Like and subscribe. Call out culture cultivated a crusade of criticism.